In a previous video I talked about my recent rediscovery of film photography after several years of shooting digital only, and whilst I've been quite happy with the results from the lab so far, there was one problem. I had quite limited creative control over the final image, so I decided to try scanning my own negatives at home, and the results were quite surprising. Hi, I'm Grant, I'm a Midlands-based photographer here in the UK, and in this video I'm going to share my exact home scanning setup and why I chose this over other options. I'll share my complete scanning workflow, including the software I'm using to achieve the final result, and most importantly I'll be showing you some side-by-side comparisons of my own scans versus the labs and sharing my honest opinions on the process. So let's get into it. So following a previous video on this topic, I was given a couple of recommendations from viewers regarding home scanning options I should consider, those being the Valoi Easy35 and the Plustek 8300 scanner, both capable of producing very similar results. However, how you get there is slightly different. I actually decided to go for the Valoi Easy35, mainly for simplicity reasons. It enables me to utilise my existing digital camera setup, as it's essentially a light box that you attach to a macro lens on your camera, whereas the Plustek scanner is a dedicated piece of hardware that needs to be plugged in and connected at your desk. And on paper at least, the Easy35 is the cheaper of the two options. More on this later. For the scanning camera, I decided to use my Fujifilm X-H2, mainly for its 40 megapixel sensor, which gives plenty of resolution for scanning 35mm negatives. Now technically I didn't already own a dedicated macro lens, and I was intending to use a set of macro extension tubes which I already owned, which in theory should be okay. However, in practice I wasn't able to get close enough to the negative to fill the frame but also achieve critical focus. So I ended up picking up a dedicated macro lens for the job, so I went for a 7 Artisan 60mm f2.8. It's a fully manual lens, so it's quite an affordable option compared to the first party lenses. However, importantly, it provides that 1:1 magnification ratio, which is really important for this type of work. And straight away the results were significantly better with me being able to fill the frame and achieve critical focus. So if you're a Fujifilm shooter like me, this lens is definitely worth considering. So whilst this setup requires a little bit of trial and error to get things dialed in correctly, once you've got the hardware set up, it really is set and forget, and you can leave it fully assembled so it's ready to go whenever you need to do some scanning. It's really quite convenient. So before we start scanning, there are a few things to consider that can make a big difference to the final result. The first being use your camera's base ISO to maximise image quality and minimise noise. The second being to switch your camera to an electronic shutter mode to minimise vibration. And the third being to use the optimal aperture setting for your lens to achieve maximum sharpness. And for most lenses that's around f8. Finally, for your shutter speed and white balance, you don't need to worry too much. So set the camera to aperture priority mode and set your camera to auto white balance. And because we're shooting in RAW, we'll be correcting that later in Lightroom. And one final tip that will save you a lot of frustration later on is to use a rocket blower to blow the dust off your negatives before you scan them, and also to wear cotton gloves when you're handling your negatives, just to eliminate any damage or fingerprints on the negatives themselves. And once everything is set up, the scanning process itself is incredibly simple. Firstly, slide the negatives into the holder until the frame appears in the viewfinder. We then zoom in using the camera's focus assist to achieve critical focus on the grain of the negative or any high contrast areas. We stop the lens down to f8 if we haven't done so already, and then all we need to do is take the photo. And once you get into a rhythm, you can really scan a whole roll of film in less than 10 minutes. For me, the hardest thing was actually getting the negatives in and out of the archive sleeves wearing cotton gloves. It's harder than you think, but I'm sure it gets easier with practice. So once the negatives are captured in camera, the next thing we need to do is to import them into Lightroom and convert them from a negative into a positive. And for me, I'm using Negative Lab Pro, which is a paid plugin for Lightroom. But we'll jump to a screen share now where I can take you through my process and some of the settings that I use just to achieve some consistent results across the roll. So here we are in Adobe Lightroom Classic, and as you can see, I've grabbed a selection of photos from a recent roll of film. These were all shot on Kodak Gold 200. So first thing we do is we switch over to the Develop module, and what I do first of all is take a white balance reading from the edge of the frame, and then using the keyboard shortcut of Ctrl and N, we get the Negative Lab Pro interface pop up, and the first things you see is the type of film. So in this case it's a colour negative, the source is digital camera, and here we can pick our type of scanner. Now these are presets, if you will, that Negative Lab Pro have created. I tend to use the Frontier option just for a slightly more neutral look, and then all we do is we hit convert. So it's always incredible to see the colours jump out at you when you're converting from a negative. And straight off the bat, this looks pretty good. What I tend to do though is just make a couple of very simple tweaks. On the tone profile, I keep this on linear. So again, these are presets that have been created by Negative Lab Pro, and it's very much a subjective thing, but linear tends to give a more neutral look, which is a good starting point. And then all I do is by eye make a couple of tweaks, and I don't go overboard here. I typically might raise the darks a little bit, maybe the lights a little bit here. White balance adjustment, I tend to keep it on auto neutral, but you can change this to suit the scene. I turn the sharpening off here, and then all we do is we hit apply to convert it. So first thing to point out is when working with the positive, it does allow us to edit the file as we would do with any other photo in Lightroom. What I do want to do though is just apply some additional sharpening. So I tend to just do this by eye, just to get it to a place where it looks good and not over sharpened. You also don't want to soften the image because you lose all of your grain detail. Okay, so there we have it. We've taken our negative, converted it to a positive using Negative Lab Pro, made some tweaks to the white balance and the tonality of the image, and applied some sharpening detail, and that's it. So having now gone through the process, what do I actually think? Well, for me, I actually prefer the results I'm getting from my own scans. The biggest difference I've found is when working with highlight and shadow detail and also white balance. These three things combined make such a big impact to the results you'll get from your film photography. And whilst the results I was getting from the lab were generally okay, in some instances they were coming back quite crunchy and lacking in highlight or shadow detail. And with a JPEG only scan, I was quite limited in terms of what I could do to recover that detail. However, with the raw files that I'm now producing, I've got so much more flexibility to adjust these settings in post-production, and these micro adjustments can make such a big difference. Now let's talk about the Valoi Easy35 itself. Conceptually, I think it's a great product. It's compact, convenient, and incredibly easy to use. However, there is one issue which keeps coming up time and time again online, which is the warm vignetting issue, which can show up on the edge of frame in some instances. Now, I fully agree that this type of issue just shouldn't exist in a product like this, particularly at this price point. However, I wouldn't go as far as saying it's an absolute deal breaker, because you can minimize the effect of these artifacts by following the recommended guide. And dependent on the scene, you may not notice it at all. However, at the time of making this video, Valoi have actually just announced a version 2 of the Easy35, which supposedly resolves 95% of these reported issues, which is interesting. So for me personally, I've actually decided to sell my version 1. But that's only so I can pick up the version 2, because I'm keen to see that these issues are resolved, and I think the overall product will be much improved for it. The home scanning and conversion process has also been really valuable for me as part of this film photography rediscovery journey that I'm on, as it's shown me just how much flexibility there is in a negative file. And importantly, over time, it should actually save money. And even though my cost of entry is slightly higher than I originally anticipated, having to pick up a macro lens, I am still confident that it will pay back over time. And at the end of the day, the final image is all that matters. So that's been my experience of home scanning with the Valoi Easy35, and I hope you found that helpful if you were considering home scanning for yourself. And let me know in the comments, what should I try next as part of this rediscovery of film photography? Perhaps some film development? We'll see. So until next time, take care, keep shooting, and I'll see you in the next one. Bye for now.